joined this week by fellow Des Moines Film Society board member Nick Rankowski. So, Nick, thank you for joining us on the stream.
Good evening, everyone. How are you?
And Nick, I don't know, do you want to give a quick introduction to folks who don't know you?
Sure. As Ben said, I'm on the Des Moines Film Society board. I've been a movie lover since I was a kid, and when Ben reached out to me 3 or 4 years ago about joining the board, it was the exact type of thing that I wanted to be involved in. I lived in Los Angeles for a while after I graduated from school, and what I missed when I moved back to Iowa, where I'm from, is the amount of films that you can see in a place like LA or Chicago or New York, and really not, I mentioned the 3 biggest cities in the country, really the amount of films you can see in other cities our size. And I felt that had long time felt that Des Moines needs an artier scene when it comes to movies, and that's what we're trying to build with the Film Society. So I'm pleased to be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I remember bonding over the New Beverly in one of our first conversations about you joining the.
Yeah, the New Beverly was a favorite of mine in LA, a great, great theater. And for everyone who would think that LA is unaffordable, you could get $3 matinee tickets as late as 2010 when I lived there. Mm-hmm. I know I shouldn't say this, but the theater has closed down, perhaps because they were charging $3 for tickets. But it was a great theater that was there for years and years and years. I think it actually does exist in some capacity. But
yeah, Tarantino bought it, and it's still running.
We did.
And it is still the programming is a little bit different, but it's still, I would say, similar to what it was then. And they show everything on 35. But yeah, no, that was my favorite place to go of all those many places out there as well. But Nick, you kind of gave us a pretty good segue into something that we wanted to talk about that came up today. Came out in the Business Record, I think, first, and several other places caught up on it. And that is, of course, that we, the Des Moines Film Society, are in the process of purchasing, restoring, renovating, and operating the Varsity Theater. So that's something that Nick and I, the rest of the board, many other volunteers and people have been involved in for a good year and a half now. And so it was kind of exciting today to see that sort of get out there into the public sphere, and to see what I saw was really just kind of an overwhelmingly positive reaction to that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's just great to be talking about it. And then sort of, as you mentioned with the New Beverly, movies have always evolved from one era to the next in terms of what has remained has been people's desire to see great movies. And the Varsity Theater is one of the oldest and continual running independent movie theaters in Iowa. It's great to try to honor that history in a new way. So I feel very fortunate that is now public, and that we can get to the business of making it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of the newsiness of this, why this came out today, is we do tomorrow we're making a presentation before the Des Moines Landmark Committee, asking them to designate the Varsity as a Des Moines landmark, which we certainly feel that it is, as the last remaining historic theater in Des Moines. And so we'd love to see that recognition for it. And that's also part of our long-term plan for it, which does involve historic tax credits and things like that, which will help us fund the restoration and everything. So I would encourage anyone who happens to be watching this on Facebook or elsewhere who doesn't already get our newsletter. Newsletter is the best way to stay up on everything that we're doing. So you can sign up for that at DesMoinesFilm.org. And follow along. You'll be hearing a lot more from us. We will be launching a capital campaign this summer to help us raise the money, and we do need a lot of support from the Des Moines community and the film community to make this happen. But yeah, we're pretty excited about that. So I don't know, anything else we should touch on related to that, or?
Well, just that it's going to require a lot of public goodwill and momentum, and that we've started the ball rolling, and hopefully since people don't have anything else to do, they can focus on helping us do that in this time.
I agree. So, with that, Nick's joining me today to talk about Corpus Christi. And Corpus Christi is the third film that has been in our virtual cinema. And you can watch that through this Thursday. So, if you haven't seen it yet, you can still jump in there at DesMoinesFilm.org. So, I don't know, Nick, you want to kick things off? What did you, we didn't really talk about this ahead of time. So what did you think?
Yeah, no, you put all the onus on me. It's Corpus Christi is a Polish movie from that was nominated for the international Oscar this last year. And lost to Parasite, as did everything else.
Right.
But it's in the rich tradition of Polish films being nominated for that award. I don't think people, when they think of European movies, Poland may not come directly to mind, but in Polish fashion, there's a high number of movies that have been nominated for international Oscars from Poland, but the lowest percentage of winners.
Oh yeah.
So it's often a bridesmaid, very infrequently a bride.
Right.
And this movie is about a convict, and it's unclear what he did, and it's even unclear. And this may be my ignorance of the Polish penal system, but they keep referring to it as juvenile detention, and it's hard to say if he's in a full prison capacity. But anyway, he's locked up at the beginning of the movie.
Right.
But in his incarceration has found God, and when he gets out of jail, impersonates a priest in a small community, and does so fairly successfully. And the drama of the movie comes from: is he going to be caught in this? Is he getting? You've seen this type of movie before, where a person with a checkered past pretends to be a person of good morality, and it changes both the community and the person in that process.
Right. It's basically a Polish Sister Act.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Very much so. There are some other subtle differences.
Yeah.
But that is the crux of it. Except, it's funny that you bring up a Hollywood movie. Right. What I just described, you feel like you can close your eyes and see that movie because you've seen it a million times, that it's going to be sentimental, or that everybody learns a lesson in the end.
Yep.
And that's kind of true here, but it's not in a way that I've really seen before.
Yeah.
It's a fairly well-worn premise, but there's nothing original under the sun. There's only like 5 or 6 stories anyway, and every movie you see is just one type of those sort of stories. And so I'm not trying to make it seem cliche. It's very different, and I was kept on my toes as to what was going to happen the whole time. So it stars a young man whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce, who is really the center of the movie and gives a great performance. He looks and acts in terms of intensity like a young Christopher Walken, I thought.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and I knew of this movie. I'd seen its preview when the last movie I saw in the theaters in the before times. When I saw Emma at the Floor, they were going to show Corpus Christi now or whenever, March or whatever. And so they showed the preview there, and I'd heard of it because I'd watched the Oscars. But this happens a lot with international features. You look at the poster, which has this sort of you see our fake priest in this sort of rock and roll posture.
Right.
The American tagline is, I think it's preacher, sinner, imposter, which kind of gives this comedic or con man, catch me if you can type of angle, and it's not that. The character very much genuinely found what he considers a religion and wants to be a priest, and would do it the traditional way if he hadn't been told that they would never take ex-cons like himself.
Yeah.
And even the way he becomes the imposter priest is it seems spur of the moment. It doesn't say, it's not
Right.
calculated, and then he finds himself in over his head and just keeps going. But
Yeah.
it's not really ever played for laughs. There's one time when he has to interview with the current priest or a vicar, I think, bishop, anyway, his boss.
Yeah.
That could be kind of funny, but it's more stressful as you're hoping he guesses the right answers to the questions of
Yeah.
where did you study seminary, it and it's it does kind of keep you on the edge of your seat.
Yeah.
But he's not trying to fool anybody.
Right. And I want to get back into some of that in just a second, but we did have a comment in the
Yeah.
stream, and Nick, I think you know Polish films better than I do, and I thought this was a good question from Vanessa, who is a good friend of ours. Is there a distinguishing characteristic that unifies Polish films? Like, for example, many Danish films I've seen are kind of melancholic, even with a happy ending. I don't feel like I know Polish films really as a body that well. What's your take on that?
Yeah, again, I think if you like world cinema at all, in any introduction, you're going to spend time in France and in Italy,
Right.
Or England, which don't really feel like foreign movies anyway.
Right.
And those certainly have bustling cinemas, and especially for people who are interested in Western films, those are two great places. But you don't have to dig very deep before you get to Poland. I'm not going to say that I'm a Polish film expert. I am Polish American, and that probably makes my interest a little bit heavier than someone who's not. But if Danish films are underlined by their melancholy, which I think is a pretty good take based on, say, Carl Theodor Dreyer's movies, Polish films are not too dissimilar. There's a lot of cynicism.
Right.
If you're looking at, really, there are two giant pillars of Polish movie making, both dead now. The first is Andrzej Wajda, who died 2 or 3 years ago. And he pretty much made his movies in Poland through communism, and therefore had to make some artistic compromises because of that. His great movies include Ashes and Diamonds, which may be the greatest Polish movie ever made, up through his last movie, or one of his last movies, called Katyn, which I think was nominated for an Oscar, which is probably 6 or 7, 8 years old now. But they are stamped by a level of fatalism. Things are going to get us. There's the cards are going to be stacked against humanity. There is something's always going to trip us up.
Right.
And then the other pillar is Krzysztof Kieślowski, who's probably a more famous figure because he made a lot of his movies he was not necessarily a defector, but a lot of his movies were made in France and Western Europe, including The Double Life of Veronique, the Three Colors trilogy, great series of movies. Blue is one of my all-time favorite movies.
Yeah.
And then his magnum opus, The Decalogue, which was it's a 10-hour movie in which each hour is about one of the 10 commandments. And I say that, forget Cecil B. DeMille. It's the the stories about the 10 commandments are told in this O. Henry-ish ironic modern way, in which it's sometimes hard to tell if this one's about thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not covet the neighbor's wife, or which one it's about. I mean, they're very allegorical, but again, this sense of moral ambiguity. Kieślowski, very much a moral philosopher of ambiguity, of almost Nolan-esque in setting up these impossible moral conundrums for his characters. But at the center of it is always this ambiguity, and I think that exists here in Corpus Christi, in which you're not quite sure. Okay, he's definitely faking his way into the heart of this community. He's taking, I think, his role as a spiritual leader seriously, but he does fall in love with a woman and has no problem going to bed with her, which a priest is not supposed to do.
Yeah.
And
Right.
you know, he also is not trained in that, and he's rough around the edges. So,
Right.
you know, and further, in the situation he's there to fix, this tragedy in the community in which a car crash has taken the lives of a number of young people in the community is really complicated, of who's at fault and
Yeah.
who, really less about trying to find who to blame and more about his ability to help the community let go of their anger with each other and themselves. And that is a fairly Polish idea as far as movies go.
Yeah, well, and just kind of jumping back to something that you said earlier on, and I agree. You know, we've got a really simple premise here, and a premise a really nimble premise that could go in a number of directions. So it could be played for laughs. It could be played in a very kind of saccharine way. It could be played in a real sort of like faith film kind of kind of way. Could go a lot of different
it could
ways.
be really cynical, like a Bad Santa type.
Oh, absolutely,
right.
absolutely. It could just be about what a fraud organizer is, and all of those are much less interesting directions than where this film goes. And so, and the situation you mentioned with this kind of car crash and this trauma there. I mean, that's a really messy, complicated situation that this young man comes into there, where there's been this tragedy, and it's in a small town where a lot of it kind of boils down to, this is a small enough town that everyone has to live together. So the people who were victims of this tragedy, the people who were potentially perpetrators or at fault for this tragedy, they're seeing each other every day. And that's a really interesting and I mean, gosh, a complex drama for someone like a priest to have to solve. So that the fact that then the person we have to solve this is this young man who kind of has aspirations of being a priest, which again I think is a really interesting choice here, because he does sort of kind of stumble his way into this. He lies just a bit, but he more or less backs into this. But he's not just a con man, and he's not there to like rob the collection plate. He feels kind of a genuine calling to do that. And this is sort of like his opportunity to play that role and find out, can I actually do this? And that becomes really, I think, really interesting.
Yeah, and it should be said too that the girl he falls for is just as instrumental at helping. In many ways, she's the driver for bridging this gap. And have to take some pretty significant sacrifices in terms of her family and her friends to try to make the situation better. It reminded me a little bit. We're talking about the difference between. I also should keep in mind that I'm not convinced that there is, by and large, such a thing as a unified Polish cinema, or as much as there is an Italian cinema. There are bad, lazy movies in Polish that we just never see.
Right.
I just mentioned two figures out of thousands, in some of their worldviews, and this movie does fall into that a little bit. But I think that's just the ones that we get imported.
Right.
The thing that someone might see on a Friday night is not too different from what we might watch on a Friday.
Right.
Probably not as good special effects or as many Hollywood stars, but but it did remind me one of this way this could have gone. If you're familiar at all with the musical Dear Evan Hansen, which is also about a tragedy in which a fraudulent actor tries to create healing. And I'm not going to really lambaste at this because it is a musical, and that's what they, people want a happy ending when they go to a musical. But this was much happier. The movie is much happier to let you consider the ambiguities as opposed to the musical, which is underlying answer is trying to tell you this is what's right and this is what's wrong. There's not a lot of answers here.
Yeah. And Tony just asked the question. He said, "Do Polish movies have a big unification by religion?"
I would say only in so much that Poland has a big unification. The Polish culture has a big unification by religion. It's an overwhelmingly Catholic country, and has been almost for unbroken for 1,000 years. In which, especially the last 250 of which have been very tumultuous, politically, militarily. I don't know if you're a history buff, but some bad things happened there 60 years ago, in which borders were redrawn and horrible acts were imposed upon them from. They had the misfortune, Poland, of spending the 18th and 19th and 20th century between two of the more belligerent countries in the world. But Catholicism, which was attacked on both sides by both the Russians and the Germans, it became a sort of Polish totem that the culture clung to. And that's not saying that they're any more moral than any other people, but culturally, they're very unified by Catholicism.
Well, and Nick, this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you about this, because you and I were both raised Catholic. I'm considerably less Catholic these days than I once was, but was absolutely raised Catholic. Went to Catholic school, kind of steeped in it, and again, this isn't a faith film in the way that an American kind of Kirk Cameron type film would be. But
this is not the case for Christ.
No, but there's but there's at the same time, I think it's a much more interesting film about faith. And I know myself personally, one thing that I always felt, and I'm not saying this like I'm the first person to have this idea. I think it's pretty universally thought. In Catholicism particularly, I think there's sometimes a real conflict between. There's this real emphasis on sort of, good works and on redemption through confession and things like this, right? But at the same time, in terms of the rituals, it's extremely rigid and has to follow these. No, it's true. It's true. So I did go to Catholic school in a college town, so I think it was a little less rigid there than it was in others. But,
sure.
But I feel like that's something that this film is really getting at, because that's almost a central question here, right? Because our main character, he feels a calling to this kind of ministry, and he has a very clear aptitude for certain aspects of it, and he's able to kind of respond to people in the community and serve their needs, even kind of help them heal some issues, right down the line, some really key things that you would say for someone of any kind of clergy, like these would be, really essential skills. At the same time, he's got some pretty, negative qualities about him. And some of them are maybe more stigma type things.
Mm-hmm.
There's also aspects to him, he's got a propensity to become violent at times. There's a lot of other things there. So I thought, to me, it felt very Catholic in that kind of dilemma.
That's interesting, because it's clear to me that the movie is not critical of the Catholic Church.
Right.
It may be critical of and I say maybe, it may be critical of the training process. It kind of makes the argument that his rawness, his greenness, and his ability to see things anew are helpful to him, whereas the older priest has gotten ossified and stuck in his ways. Not that he's a bad person, the older priest, but he doesn't have the energy. But I almost felt like it was an argument for organized religion, but agnostic of what individual sect. It seemed to me that what it was saying is that spiritual leadership is important in a community, if it's taken seriously, if it can also then call out members of a flock that are being hypocritical, and I didn't find that to be in a different setting. This could have been a rabbi or a Presbyterian minister. I think it was saying that universally, if we have something that we can all touch, that can connect us as a community, it's beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of along these lines, Clinton just jumped in with a good question too. How would you compare it to other priest-centered character studies? And he mentions Winter Light and First Reformed. I mean, First Reformed definitely came to mind for me. I think because I've seen it more, maybe more recently,
Sure.
and it to me there was some parallels with First Reformed in what I was just talking about someone who's in a clergy member who reaches or sort of reaches a point where what he feels is right
Yeah.
and what his ministry hierarchy says should be done diverge, and obviously they come in very different ways. He's Ethan Hawke's character there is kind of near the end of his time as a clergy person, and he's come through the correct channels and is now kind of going astray, whereas this character is kind of airdropped in from an unusual place. But I saw parallels there. I don't know, either of those, did you?
Well, I didn't think of either of them, only because First Reformed is about doubt. The world creeping doubt into this person's belief, and that's almost what all Bergman's about, particularly Winter Light, which is about my favorite Bergman movie, which is very much about the silence of God and this priest being like, how can I how can I have donated my life to this and not get anything in return? In his mind. I don't know, it was with those Lutherans, Bergman and Schrader. It's all about doubt, whereas Catholic filmmakers, it's usually about guilt. From Hitchcock to Scorsese, but this isn't about guilt, or it does have a Catholic stamp that there's never any question about his faith on this thing. When I'm using faith, obviously faith is a loaded word in this context, but I mean, he is certain that this is what he ought to do. So certain that he doesn't stop himself from the many, many times, especially early on, in which he could say, that, sorry, you misunderstood. I'm not a priest. And that kind of, he never turns away from that. And it's that faith in goodness. And I don't mean Christian faith. I just mean belief in the certainty of goodness that drive him and the woman and the female lead, and even allows them to dissolve some of the certainty of anger that the community has. So I understand why, based on the premise, both of those movies would come to mind, and I understand why you would think of First Reformed. I can't think of another movie with a priest as the protagonist, a man of the cloth as the protagonist. I guess the two popes came out just last year, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and as you were talking too, you mentioned the question of faith, and that a lot of these priest type films have, and Two Popes definitely has that. And there's the whole idea of I can't hear God anymore, and it's interesting here. God is not really present in this film. This is all about the people. It's the people in the community and the clergy members. It's about their kind of interpersonal relationships and their relationships with the community. So that's interesting. The one other film that I thought of a little bit in relation to this was, do you remember the Steve Martin film Leap of Faith? Came out.
I've not seen that.
Late 90s. So I haven't seen it for a number of years, and so it's one that I wonder if I went back to, I would still enjoy. But I enjoyed it quite a bit. I saw it a few times. I think back in the day, it was one of those. It was like one of those that was on HBO, and so you kind of see it a couple times. And I mean, as I recall, it did very poorly at the box office, and it was kind of marketed as a comedy, but it's not a comedy at all. And basically, Steve Martin plays tent revival fraudster, basically, with this whole real high production shtick. I mean, to be honest, it was to some extent a little ahead of its time, because I think we've only seen that kind of thing explode more since then. But they go from town to town, and he does this kind of fake healing thing, and he's got all these various tricks he uses. He ends up in this town, and and does his kind of fraudulent thing, and basically a miracle happens, or this kid who couldn't walk before can suddenly walk. And so it's a much more cynical movie, for sure, but it still has some some interesting parallels there. And it's really focused on his character and this idea that he had no faith at all in what he was doing. I mean, he was very sure that he was a fraudster. And so
Yeah.
when this good thing actually happens, whereas everyone else is happy about this, he's quite miserable about it. So,
And have you seen Elmer Gantry?
I have not
Yeah.
actually.
It's much older, 59 or something, with Burt Lancaster,
Yep.
but it's the same. I don't know about the same premise because I've not seen the other movie, but it's definitely about a snake oil salesman, Christian evangelicist.
Yeah.
But that is interesting because it's hard. What's the most ambiguous part about the movie, about Corpus Christi, is what he takes away from this, because at the end of the movie, this isn't really a spoiler.
Yeah.
He has been found out, such as it is, that they always are these types of movies. He's no longer a priest because he never was one, but you get a sense that the lesson he learns. Actually, I don't. When I say you get a sense, you literally just get a sense, because it's not clear.
This is an aggressively ambiguous ending.
Yes, and to the point that it's a weird. I mean, again, the last 5 minutes are, and I can't even say positively, but so unlike the previous 100 minutes that I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I can extrapolate in my sort of Hollywood tidy way that he gets some self-belief in himself, that he goes from a timid-ish, I mean, still sort of hardened as a criminal, but someone who didn't really have a lot of self-worth, gaining that, but it exerts itself in what you can only describe as a non-Christian way. It's a unusual ending.
Yeah, it is, and I mean, I don't know. Sometimes you have more of an unresolved ending that people call an ambiguous ending. Like, it doesn't exactly tell you where things are going, but it nudges you very strongly that this is where this is going, or this was the important theme that we should have taken away from this, or whatever. This movie just kind of, it cuts to black, and you're like, okay, there we.
Yeah, if you say so, man.
Yeah. Right.
And again, I don't know if it 100% worked for me.
It felt truncated to me. I felt like maybe those were the right beats for it to go through, but that very, very end section happens in such a short frame of time. I felt a little jarred by it as well.
And it's also, I feel like you've brought up a point. If we're talking about some of the negatives, it does rush some things. It almost feels like a different movie sandwiched between the movie it starts and finishes, because the interaction between some of the prisoners, I don't think it's established as well as it could be, or in a way that I was able to follow the way I wanted to. So it's a little uneven. I'm not going to say I think Parasite deserved the Oscar,
right?
But it is also refreshing, though, and this is one of the reasons I love movies. Is I'm not sure I've seen anything quite like it.
Right.
Yeah. So I would rather for it could have been very easy to finish this movie differently, in a way that I've seen, and that's much more conventional. And so that it's swung for the fences, I think is even if it didn't work 100% for me, is a positive.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Anything else on that, or we kind of covered? I don't know that I have anything else on Corpus Christi. Other than,
we are the 4 leading discussers of this movie in English at this point.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't think there's anything else I'd like to say.
Well, we'll have to be sure we tag this video as that, so we rack up views accordingly. So anything you've watched lately, or kind of since we've been in quarantine, that really stands out? You did do a streaming pick for us, which was great. But I don't know, anything else you've seen recently that stuck out to you that you wanted to talk about or recommend?
I can't recommend if you're a movie lover, and I know this is I'm going to do the corporate speak that everyone has grown tired of these days. But in this uncertain time, I understand that it may be uh, this may not be the time to be adding subscriptions. But if you're a movie lover and you haven't strongly considered the Criterion Channel, uh, do so. It is easily for at $9.99 a month or whatever it is. It's something around there. It is for me pound for pound the most joy I think I get for that dollar amount. And if it came between even Netflix and Criterion Channel, I would drop Netflix. So uh, anyway,
Yeah.
I've been getting my value out of that quite a bit during quarantine, including movies, documentaries I'd never seen before by the Maisels brothers, which I'd heard of and knew, but I'd never watched Salesman before. And I saw that in the last couple of weeks. Never seen Gimme Shelter before, and I'd never seen Grey Gardens, and I just loved all three of them for different, but similar reasons.
Yeah.
And that started off. I've been watching The Last Dance, the Chicago Bulls documentary, and that made me go back and rewatch Hoop Dreams, which I hadn't seen in a long time. And that's such a magnificent movie. And then just yesterday was Sunday, I watched Giant. You ever seen Giant with
With I can't think.
Liz Taylor and James Dean?
Yep, James Dean. Yeah, yeah.
That's a big, weird, ungainly, the type of movie that rightly or wrongly you'd never see again. And so
it's in one of those, and I don't know what I don't, it's in one of those kind of weird color palettes too. And I don't know.
It looks like a plate of Raising Cane's.
Yeah.
It's like all different browns.
Yeah. I don't know all of my film stocks, and some of those companies had proprietary things they used, or things that were in vogue for a period of time. But that's definitely one that in my mind, just the coloring of it is just kind of weird. So
I remember liking it a lot, and I liked it quite a bit this last time.
Yeah,
but for different reasons. It was not. It's weird for it being 200 minutes long. I almost remembered nothing of the plot, and then rewatching it, liked it, but for different reasons. After getting over like, why did I like this 5 or 6 years ago, whenever I first saw it? But anyway, it's always good to. Interesting movies, there's never wasted time rewatching, even at 200 minutes. And when am I ever going to get 200 minutes when I've got nothing to do?
Yeah.
How about you? What have you seen?
I see. I asked you, and then I started thinking, and I tell you what, I have not seen a whole lot that jumps out at me. I've been seeing a little more television. I've definitely been watching The Last Dance, and absolutely loving it, but completely unable to consider it in any kind of critical capacity, because it's just like candy for me, because it's all these things that were really important to me in my childhood. That's
desperately important.
Oh my gosh. I what I remembered watching this last episode, they were on the 93 Eastern Conference Finals with the Knicks, and I remembered that my mom made me go to my sister's dance recital during one of the games of that series, but I negotiated to be able to bring my Walkman and headset in with me, and I only had to take them off during my sister's dance. So I was sitting through, and children's dance recitals are all like 3.5 hours long and just brutal. But I had the radio broadcast on of that series, and I remember how important that was. And when the Knicks went up early, and they were just Starks, and they were such villains. And I mean, this was epic stuff to me as a child. Someone who is 25 who watched this and said this means nothing to me, I would not argue with them that it should mean something.
It should, yeah. And it's funny. I mean, but it does speak to something. They came about, those 90s Bulls. I think this is what's so interesting, relitigating this 20 years afterwards, if you were a Midwestern kid, particularly from a community that didn't have a professional basketball team,
Right.
your center of gravity, if you were sports inclined at all,
Mm-hmm.
just was completely sucked up, not just by the team, but by Michael Jordan, who
Oh
was
yeah.
legitimately, and I say this, I'm a little ashamed of this, but it's no less true, one of the two most important male figures in my life from
Yeah.
1990 to 1995. I
Oh
think by the end I finally sort of outgrew it. But you just said about the 93 finals, the famous story, my parents even texted me about it based on last night's episode. I was so apoplectic after the second overtime of the Phoenix Suns finals series
mm-hmm.
in game 3 or whatever it was, that
Mm-hmm.
Michael could even allow it to go to a third overtime. I was inconsolable, 9 years old, that they had to come in and tell me they won, the Bulls won. And what's weird is that you really couldn't even call me a sports fan. It's just that he
Right.
was such a legendary figure.
Right.
And you can even see this in the documentary. The story of Michael Jordan
Mm-hmm.
is it's like the Beatles. It's congestible. It's upward trajectory the whole way, and it's mythic. So it resonates. My wife, who couldn't give, has no interest or had no interest in basketball at that age, is enwrapped by this thing.
Well,
Because it's discovering it the first time.
Yeah, no, it's funny you say that. And I said, I wouldn't argue with somebody if they weren't interested in it. But I've been watching it with my 12-year-old son, and he's completely absorbed by it as well. And
part of it is the filmmaking. I mean, it's not really critical. It's a world different from Hoop Dreams, which is really less about basketball. But yeah, it's just a good story.
Yeah, it is. It is, and there's a lot going on there. So that, gosh, I've been watching a lot of that. I did start that Hollywood, the Netflix limited series thing, and I've seen the documentary that's kind of based on. I don't know if you ever saw that. I think it's called Scotty and the Hollywood something or other, but it's about an actual guy who worked at this gas station out there and then ran a gas station that basically, serviced a lot of celebrities and just a lot of kind of, different clientele out there and everything. And he had written a book previously that the documentary is based on. And I don't know that all of his claims there's definitely some question about the veracity of some of his claims, but I mean, undoubtedly quite a bit of it is true. And so, so I don't know. I mean, the documentary I've only seen one episode of it so far, and it's obviously got a number of problems, but I'm a bit of a sucker for a real, just kind of like classic Hollywood set thing, even if it's, kind of, cheese ball and everything else. So
part of the joy anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I did watch, actually I did watch Pahokee, the other film that's in our virtual cinema right now.
I'm going to try to catch up with that this week.
Yeah, it's worth seeing. It's it's very much a cinema verite style documentary. So it's you're there in the room, and you're there in long shots, and it's a lot about just kind of absorbing the atmosphere. And so as those
from?
It's set in Florida. Pahokee is a town in kind of Everglades-ish Florida, small-ish town. Very, very, heavily African American and Latino community, very poor. It's set, its focuses on 4 high school seniors, and it kind of follows sort of their last year there. So it reminded me just a little bit of Hale County this evening. Not nearly as good as that film, but in the same kind of just, you're in a community in a lot of ways and you're kind of absorbing it, but with a little bit more of a narrative spine, and the fact that we have these 4 this kind of limited group of people who are also progressing through a senior year that's going to have kind of some of its, football season and prom and, just some of these kind of like benchmark things that are in it. So, I mean, very verite, like, you really have to commit yourself to it. I do think it's the kind of film that could be a challenge sometimes to watch at home, because there's definitely moments that, you could pick your phone up. But as with a lot of these films, the longer you sit with it, the more you're kind of get into the rhythm of the people and the place. and there are some real kind of powerhouse moments later, later in the film that just.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna definitely watch it this week.
So that was one other one that I saw there. So anyway, we're running about the end of how long we usually run on these. So I did want to mention though, over the next month, we're gonna, in addition to talking about some of the films that are in our virtual cinema, things like that, we're gonna be doing a little bit of a kind of series retrospective. We're calling it the Indie Black and White 80s. And so we're going to be looking at 3 different films from the 1980s, each one first films from very interesting directors that were all shot in black and white. So next week on the 11th, Clinton and Nicole and Olivia are going to be back on. They're going to be talking about Stranger Than Paradise, the Jim Jarmusch first feature. Then on the 18th, we'll be talking about She's Gotta Have It, the Spike Lee film. And on the 25th, we're going to be talking about Chan is Missing, the Wayne Wang film, which I know is available on Canopy. If you have Canopy, I feel like that's probably the least seen of those 3, and I'm a big fan of it. So I'd encourage folks, if you haven't seen all 3 of them, they're all 3 worth seeing. But that's one I definitely say seek out, is pretty interesting. So, all right. Otherwise, anything else, Nick? Or
no, except that yeah, this has been I can't wait to get so we can talk about baseball, you and me. But it's always fun to talk about movies as well.
Nick and I are big Cardinals fans, so I did wear one of my St. Louis hats.
I appreciate that.
So
and the True False T-shirt. So
I am wearing a True False T-shirt down here as well. So I kind of went, film and baseball. Although honestly, if I eliminated the film and baseball items from my wardrobe, I'd have like a suit and 2 shirts or something like that. So that's about what I'd have left. So anyway. Sure. All right. Hey, thank you. Those of you who have watched us live, those of you who check us out later on, again, DesMoinesFilm.org, where you can stream films from our virtual cinema. You can follow along, find out more about the Varsity Cinema Project, everything else. And we'll see you guys later.